Move on to a story that I'm still up in the air about how I'm gonna respond to Tamar, okay? But Tamar recently did an interview with L'Oreal, and I don't know, she just...
The room feels unnervingly still, the kind of silence that only exists right before something breaks. The camera is live. The voice falters, and for a brief moment, it's clear the speaker isn't sure how much they're willing to expose. Tamar admits she doesn't quite know how to react as she walks through the night. But what begins as a measured explanation slowly turns heavier. Her pace shifts. The pauses grow longer. Suddenly, what was described as a simple evening out no longer sounds simple at all. A birthday, a car ride, a house? A choice that many viewers believe altered everything. At first, the story feels disjointed, almost innocent. But then the inconsistencies surface. In one breath, she claims she doesn't know what happened. In the next, she shares details that hint something went terribly wrong. Are you aware of what really happened to you? That single question set the internet ablaze. Almost immediately, social media users began piecing things together. Comment sections overflowed with speculation. Clips were replayed repeatedly, with people dissecting timelines, body language, and what was carefully avoided. And right at the center of it all, one name kept resurfacing: Mendeecees. Not because of anything proven, not because of an official report, but because of proximity, access, and presence. You say enough to raise suspicion, then pull back and say, "I didn't do anything. I never said his name." But it starts with, "Are you aware of what really happened to you?" Followed by, "No, I'm not." Then, "Can you talk about it?" And, "I can talk about it, but I don't know what really happened." And people filled in the rest with what they believed happened once the camera stopped. Then the tone shifted again, this time at a birthday gathering. "I don't like that. I don't like that at all," she snaps, confronting the situation head on. "I'm telling you to your face. You were a bold-faced liar." She insists that night was never about her. According to her, everyone was just looking for food, calling around, asking what was open nearby. She claims she said everything near her was closed and suggested going elsewhere. What began as reflection quickly became accusation. The voice sharpened. The anger was undeniable. Suddenly, this wasn't just Tamar's story anymore. It was about narratives being challenged and feelings being wounded. Viewers watched as confusion turned into confrontation. Uncertainty into rage. As headlines spread about jail rumors, tests, and betrayal, one thing stood out. Someone was taking the blame. Someone else was being shielded. And someone based on the version being told wasn't being fully honest. And when it seemed like it couldn't get any darker, Yandy's silence became impossible to overlook. Because in moments like this, silence isn't empty. It's loud, and it leads to a question no one can dodge. If this story was never meant to be public, how did it spiral this far? And who really lost control of it? When the clip ended, the story didn't fade. It multiplied. What made everything feel so volatile wasn't just what was said, but what was implied between the words. The way the speaker kept returning to the same night. The same place, the same people, as if repeating it might finally force the truth to settle. Because according to the account being shared, that night wasn't wild or chaotic. It wasn't reckless or dramatic at first. It was supposed to be ordinary, routine, a birthday, a quick stop for food, plans that kept changing. And yet every version of the night circled back to the same uneasy reality that things didn't play out the way they were later described. What stood out wasn't just the sequence of events, but how often it was stressed that this wasn't some big, thoughtful gesture. This wasn't a story about throwing a birthday celebration for a friend who somehow betrayed you afterward. "That's not right, Tamar," the voice pushes back. "And it's not fair to me. My feelings are hurt." This wasn't a carefully arranged moment or a scene meant to be misread. The frustration was unmistakable. Someone, somewhere, had reshaped the night into a version that didn't feel honest. And the internet picked up on it immediately, as people began comparing what was said here to what had already been circulating online. The gaps became impossible to ignore. The interview carried one tone. Social media was telling a very different story. That's where the tension sharpened. The speaker doesn't just reject the version being told. They question why it was framed that way in the first place. why certain details were emphasized while others quietly disappeared, and why the night was suddenly presented with the emotional weight of something far more serious than it seemed at the time. You're creating a narrative. My feelings are hurt. That line hit hard, because from that point on, this stopped being about memory and became about motive. According to this account, this wasn't confusion or miscommunication. It was someone shaping events to appear wronged, while others were left dealing with the consequences. And those consequences came quickly. Viewers started pointing out inconsistencies. Why did this story keep shifting? Why did certain names appear in one version and vanish in another? Why did the tone jump from casual to catastrophic? The most unsettling part wasn't even the accusation itself, but the certainty behind it. There's a moment described in the back of the car where it seemed clear to the speaker that others wanted privacy. That's why, when they were dropped off at Tamar's house, they didn't go inside. They got in their car and left, explaining they felt uncomfortable with what they were seeing. That detail changed everything, because now the story wasn't just about what may have happened later that night, but about what might have been unfolding well before that. There's a point in the transcript where the speaker makes it clear the discomfort started early. Not jealousy, not suspicion, just a feeling that something wasn't right. Observing closeness, body language, interactions that didn't sit comfortably, even if at the time they were brushed off. That sense of unease reframed the entire night. Suddenly, small moments carried heavier meaning. And this is where Mendeecees' name began circulating in ways that made people uneasy. Not through direct claims, not through confirmed facts, but through proximity, through presence, through the reality that, according to the account, he was among the last people around when the tone of the night shifted. The speaker is careful not to claim knowledge of what happened behind closed doors. In fact, they insist they don't know. But that uncertainty, paired with the intensity of everything else being said, became its own kind of accusation. A mention of who went upstairs was enough to ignite social media. Once that idea entered the conversation, people filled in the blanks themselves. Theories spread, assumptions hardened, and what started as commentary quickly began to feel like a public investigation. Yet the most explosive moment didn't come from what was suggested. It came from what was rejected. The speaker forcefully pushes back against the idea that something violent or tragic occurred. They question the severity being implied. They question how someone could claim not to know what happened while describing it in such detail. And that contradiction only added more fuel to a story that was already spiraling. That contradiction became the pulse of the entire controversy. Because if nothing happened, why the urgency? If something did happen, why the silence? And if the truth lived somewhere in the middle, why was everyone refusing to touch it? Online reactions quickly split into sides. Some accepted the account at face value, viewing it as someone finally saying what others were too afraid to admit. Others felt it was too emotional, too reactive, too scattered to be trusted. And then there were those who focused on what was missing altogether. Where was the clarification? Where was the accountability? And why were certain people staying quiet? That's when Yandy's name began trending alongside the story. Not because she spoke up, but because she didn't. In moments like this, silence becomes a message of its own. Especially when emotions are high, accusations are flying, and public opinion is already taking shape. Every hour without a response made the speculation louder. Every replay of the clip added more pressure. And hovering over all of it were the headlines that refused to fade. Claims about tests, jail, and consequences that no one on camera directly confirmed. Yet by the end of the segment, many online seemed ready to accept as truth. One thing was clear. This was no longer about a simple misunderstanding. It had turned into a public unraveling. As people dug deeper, the questions only grew more uncomfortable. Because if even part of what was being suggested was accurate, then someone wasn't just misrepresenting events. They were protecting something. And the next phase of the story is where that protection began to fracture. The shift didn't happen suddenly. It crept in slowly through tone, repetition, and the way certain details were highlighted while others were carefully brushed aside. By the time viewers realized the conversation had changed, it was already too late to separate fact from implication. Because now the story wasn't about a confusing night out anymore. It was about credibility. It was about credibility. The more the clip circulated, the more people rewatched it, not to hear what was said, but to catch what wasn't. Every pause felt deliberate. Every correction felt heavy. Each hesitation before finishing a sentence pulled viewers in closer. What unsettled people most were the contradictions at the center of it all. On one hand, the public narrative was uncertainty, confusion, not knowing what happened. On the other, the version being described here was detailed, filled with locations, timing, movements, and emotional reactions. That contrast didn't go unnoticed. The moment questioning the severity and timeline shifted everything, because suddenly the issue wasn't what happened. It was why the story was being told the way it was. Viewers began asking why someone would insist they didn't know what happened while simultaneously walking through the night in detail. Why claim confusion, yet speak with certainty about who was there, who left together, and what supposedly followed? The more it was analyzed, the more it felt like two versions of the same night were colliding. One driven by emotion, the other by strategy. That's when the speaker's tone moved from reflective to confrontational. The frustration sharpened. The language became more intentional. And for the first time, the commentary stopped circling the issue and went straight at it. The idea that a narrative was being constructed, not recalled. That mention of narrative building and hurt feelings reframed everything. It suggested the problem wasn't miscommunication or memory. It was intention. That someone chose to present the night a certain way, fully aware of how it would be received once it reached the internet. From there, the story took on a darker edge. The speaker began explaining why the version being shared didn't add up, why the emotions didn't match the events, why the response felt disproportionate to what was allegedly experienced. They questioned the urgency. They questioned the timeline. They questioned why some details were amplified while others disappeared completely. And then came the moment that changed how viewers interpreted the entire situation. The suggestion that Yandy was the one truly hurt. That single statement reshaped everything. Because now this wasn't just about Tamar. It wasn't even about what happened that night. It was about who ultimately absorbed the fallout for a story they may not have been part of at all. And that's where Yandy re-entered the picture. Not through words, but through absence. She didn't speak. She didn't respond. She didn't correct the narrative. And in a story driven by speculation, that silence became impossible to ignore. Online, people began reading meaning into every moment she chose not to say anything. Some read it as restraint, others as avoidance. A few even took it as quiet confirmation. And once those interpretations began circulating, there was no stopping them. Attention kept circling back to Mendeecees. Not because anyone made a direct claim, none were, but because of proximity, because of presence, because, according to the story, he was there during moments that later became the center of the controversy. The speaker remains cautious. They never say they know exactly what happened. In fact, they repeatedly stress that they don't. Still, the implication hangs in the air. If anyone truly knows how the night ended, it would be the people who were there when it did. That suggestion alone was enough to spark speculation. Social media did what it always does in situations like this. It filled in the gaps. People began connecting dots that may not have existed at all. Timelines were torn apart. Old clips resurfaced. Casual comments from months earlier were suddenly treated like proof. Before anyone could step in to slow it down, an entirely new narrative had formed. One filled with jail rumors. One involving alleged tests. One that turned uncertainty into assumed guilt. None of it confirmed. None of it verified. Yet all of it spread rapidly. Meanwhile, the speaker's frustration became more apparent. Not just toward Tamar, but toward the entire situation. Toward being pulled into something they never asked for. Toward being portrayed as part of a story they insist they tried to avoid. There's a moment where that frustration breaks through clearly. Not as anger, not as shouting, but as exhaustion. The kind that comes from watching your name get dragged into a storm you didn't create. While the people who could clarify things choose not to, and that's where the emotional core of this section lives. Not in accusation, not in rumor, but in the feeling of being forced to speak because silence is being used against you. The speaker makes it clear they never wanted this public. They didn't want to explain themselves. They didn't want to respond to speculation. But once the narrative took off, staying quiet stopped being an option. Because once the internet decides a story is real, facts stop mattering. That's what made the situation so volatile. By the end of this phase, the audience is left with more questions than answers. Why was the story framed the way it was? Why were some details highlighted while others were ignored? Why hasn't anyone directly clarified what happened? And why does it feel like everyone involved is protecting something? Above all, one question lingers. If nothing truly happened, why does everyone seem so afraid of the truth coming out? As the pressure continued to build, one thing became obvious. The next chapter of this story wouldn't focus on what happened that night. It would focus on who was willing to speak and who would finally break their silence. The longer the story stayed in the public eye, the heavier it became. What started as a tense explanation transformed into something far more unstable. Every word spoken earlier was being replayed, reinterpreted, and rearranged into new meanings. The internet wasn't waiting for clarity anymore. It had already started forming its own conclusions. And at the center of it all was one uncomfortable reality. The more people talked, the less clear the story became. By this point, the conversation had drifted far beyond what was actually said. Viewers weren't just listening anymore. They were investigating. They combed through timelines, compared statements, and stacked moments on top of one another, searching for the point where everything stopped making sense. What stood out most was the emotional imbalance. The speaker sounded hurt, frustrated, almost betrayed. But what unsettled people was how deeply personal the reaction felt, especially given how often the speaker insisted they never wanted to be part of this at all. That contradiction stayed with viewers. If this wasn't personal, why did it feel so personal? If this wasn't about blame, why did the tone sound so defensive? And if nothing really happened, why did the story feel so tightly controlled? As those questions circulated, the focus shifted again. This time to what wasn't being said. There was no direct denial from Tamar addressing the specific details being discussed. No clear timeline. No statement pushing back against the version of events spreading online. And in the absence of clarity, speculation rushed in to fill the space. People began analyzing language. Why say you don't know what happened, yet describe the night with such precision? Why speak publicly without confirming the facts privately? Why let a story spiral when a single statement could slow it down? Then came the part that made everything feel heavier. The repeated suggestion that the real harm hadn't been done to the speaker at all, but to someone else entirely. That idea lingered like a shadow. Because once it was said out loud that Yandy may have been the only one truly hurt by all of this, the story shifted. It reframed everything. It moved the emotional center away from drama and toward consequence. Suddenly, this wasn't about a night out. It was about loyalty, boundaries, and what happens when private moments are turned into public narratives. And still, Yandy said nothing. No statement. No clarification. No attempt to redirect the conversation. That silence became a storyline of its own. Online, people began assigning meaning to it. Some still believed it was restraint. Others believed it was calculated. A few suggested it was pain being handled privately. But no matter how it was interpreted, the result was the same. The silence amplified everything. Meanwhile, Mendeecees' name continued to linger over the conversation. Not because of anything officially stated. Not because of proof, but because of association. He was mentioned. He was present. He existed within the timeline. And in the world of online discourse, that alone was enough to keep his name in circulation. The speaker never directly accused him of wrongdoing. In fact, they were careful to avoid making any firm claims. But they also didn't shield him from speculation. They left space open and the internet rushed to fill it. That's when the story began to shift into something far more dangerous. Clips were pulled out off context. Headlines grew sharper, more aggressive. Words like jail and investigation started spreading without confirmation. Not because anyone had said them outright, but because the audience assumed them. And once those assumptions took hold, it traveled faster than the truth ever could. The speakers seemed to recognize this in real time. Their tone shifted again, this time towards something closer to resignation. The energy drained from their voice. There was no fire left, just the sound of someone trapped inside a narrative they know. It's longer controlled. They made it clear they didn't want to be seen as chaotic. They didn't want to be labeled an attention seeker. They didn't want to be part of internet spectacle. But they were also clear about one thing. They refused to let their silence be used against them. That's what made this portion of the story so uncomfortable. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't explosive. It was slow, heavy, and deeply human. Someone trying to explain themselves while fully aware that explaining might only make things worse. And the more they spoke, the clearer it became that this wasn't about proving innocence or guilt. It was about protecting reputation, their own and possibly someone else's. By this point, the public had already chosen sides. Some fully believed the speaker, seeing their frustration as proof of honesty. Others felt the story was being exaggerated, shaped to deflect responsibility or redirect blame. And then there were those who believed the truth lived somewhere in between, buried under emotion, fear, and the weight of public scrutiny. What intensified everything was the lack of closure. There was no final statement, no clean resolution, no confirmation of what actually happened after that night. Just fragments. And those fragments kept colliding with speculation, allowing the narrative to grow even as the facts remained unchanged. By the end of this phase, one thing was undeniable. This was no longer about what happened that night. It was about control. Who controls the story? Who controls the damage? And who ends up carrying the blame when the truth remains just out of reach? As the noise grew louder, one question weighed heavier than all the rest. If everyone insists they're telling the truth, why does the truth still feel so distant? That question is exactly where the next chapter begins. Because this is the moment when emotional tension turns into something more dangerous. This is the point where silence stops being safe. The moment everything slowed down was the moment people realized the story wasn't moving forward anymore. It was looping back on itself. The audience had heard the explanations. They had watched the emotions rise and fall. They had seen frustration spill out in waves. And yet, despite all the words, nothing felt resolved. That's what made this stage different. It wasn't loud. It wasn't explosive. It was heavy. The kind of weight that settles in when everyone involved realizes the situation has gone too far to fix easily. Because by now, the story had stopped being about the night itself. It had become about perception, how it would be remembered, how it would be interpreted, and how those interpretations would follow everyone involved long after the cameras stopped rolling. What stood out most here was the shift in tone. Earlier, the speaker sounded defensive, emotional, reactive. Now, the voice carried something else entirely. Caution, almost like someone realizing, mid-thought, that every word could make things worse. There's a moment where frustration gives way to exhaustion. Not anger, not outrage. Just the sound of someone who understands that no matter what they say next, the narrative has already taken on a life of its own. And that's where the story becomes unsettling. Because when someone reaches that point, it usually means they've realized that truth alone won't fix anything. The damage is already done. By this stage, the internet wasn't searching for clarity. It was searching for confirmation. People weren't asking what happened anymore. They were asking who to blame. And once blame enters the conversation, facts become secondary. Every pause starts to look suspicious. Every silence feels deliberate. Every attempt to calm things down gets read as avoidance. That's exactly what unfolded here. The speaker makes one thing clear. They never wanted to be part of a spectacle. They didn't want their name tangled in theories or splashed across headlines. They didn't want to be seen as stirring drama or chasing attention. But at the same time, they felt cornered, pushed to respond because their silence was being used as proof against them. And that's the paradox driving this entire situation. Speak up and you risk making it worse. Stay quiet and people assume the worst. There's no winning move as the story continued to unravel. It became clear the emotional weight wasn't just about personal hurt anymore. It was about reputation, about how fast a narrative can be created, spread, and accepted as truth without anyone stopping to question its accuracy. That's when the focus quietly shifted away from the night itself and onto what came after. The online reaction, the comments, the assumptions. People broke down every word that had been said. They compared old clips to newer ones. They questioned motives. They accused. They defended. And in the center of it all were real people dealing with the fallout of something they know, longer controlled. What made it worse was the lack of closure. No final statement. No clean explanation. No moment where someone stepped in and said, "This is what actually happened." Instead, the story just lingered. And that's often where the most damage is done. Because when a story lingers, it grows. It shifts. It absorbs whatever people project onto it. That's how rumors began to harden into belief. Not because they were confirmed, but because no one shut them down. The speaker seems to realize this as it's happening. There's regret underneath the frustration. A quiet understanding that speaking up may have added fuel instead of clarity. They emphasize more than once that chaos was never the goal. that they didn't want to hurt anyone, that they were reacting to being pulled into a version of events they didn't agree with. But by then, intention no longer mattered. The story had grown bigger than everyone involved. What stands out most toward the end is how careful the speaker becomes. Words slow down. Statements soften. It feels like someone stepping through broken glass, trying not to make anything worse with the next move. And that caution says a lot. It suggests the full truth is complicated, messy, and possibly more damaging than the public realizes. And maybe that's why no one has fully spoken. Because once you do, there's no taking it back. That's the tension hanging over this entire situation. Not scandal, not outrage, but restraint. The kind that comes from understanding the cost of saying too much. And yet, restraint doesn't stop speculation. It feeds it. By now, the audience has filled in the gaps with their own conclusions. Some believe the speaker completely. Others feel something is being hidden. A few think everyone involved carries some responsibility. But almost everyone agrees on one thing. Something about this story doesn't sit right. Not because of what's been said, but because of what hasn't. That's what makes this chapter so heavy. It's not about proving guilt or innocence. It's not about picking sides. It's about watching a private situation collapse under public scrutiny. By the end of this section, there's no explosion, no final reveal, no dramatic confession. Just a quiet realization. This situation is no longer under anyone's control. The narrative has escaped. The audience has decided what to believe. And the people at the center of it are left trying to survive the fallout, which leaves one question hanging in the air. The same one people keep coming back to. If the truth really is simple, why does everyone seem afraid to say it out loud? That question leads directly into the final chapter, where silence, speculation, and consequence finally collide. Before we close this out, there's something worth sitting with. Because at this point, this story isn't just about one night, one interview, or one viral moment. It's about how quickly narratives are formed and how hard they are to undo once they take hold. You've heard what was said. You've watched how the story unfolded. You've seen how silence, emotion, and interpretation collided in real time. Now the question is yours. Do you think the truth was misunderstood or carefully avoided? Did this situation spiral because of miscommunication or because someone knew exactly how the story would be received? And most importantly, does silence in moments like this protect people or expose them? Depending on how you see it, this story looks very different. Some see pain and frustration. Some see manipulation. Some see a private situation that never should have gone public. And others believe there's still a piece of the story we haven't heard yet. That's why your perspective matters. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Not just reactions, but real analysis. What stood out to you? What felt off? And what do you think actually happened once the cameras stopped rolling? If you think this story ends here, think again. Because when narratives like this stay unresolved, they tend to come back louder, messier, and with consequences no one expects. If you want to stay ahead of the next chapter, make sure you're subscribed. Turn on notifications and stay locked in. Because if anything else comes out, you'll hear it here first. The truth doesn't disappear, it waits. And when it surfaces, the story changes all over again.